Hey everyone. Tonight's story will make you question everything you thought you knew about romance, and maybe even about yourself. Picture this. In the heart of medieval Paris, a legendary scholar named Peter Abelard was brutally punished by the family of the woman he loved, simply because their feelings defied the rules of their world. But here's the wildest part. She chose to love him anyway for the rest of her days. But that's just the beginning. Did you know that medieval Europe's hidden archives are full of cases where people were hunted down, imprisoned, or even lost everything just for loving someone their family or their king disapproved of? And what if I told you that the most breathtaking love letters ever written weren't sent by sweethearts across a table, but by souls condemned never to meet again, pouring their entire hearts onto paper because that was all they had left? All right, get comfortable. Find that spot where you can just relax, breathe deep, and let yourself drift. Ready? Let's turn down the lights and step into the real world of medieval forbidden love. Imagine yourself in a time when simply following your heart could destroy everything you have ever known. Picture a world where love wasn't just an adventure or a mystery, but a perilous choice, one that could cost you your place in society, your family's respect, your freedom, and sometimes even your future. To walk these ancient winding streets is to understand, in medieval Europe, to love the wrong person was to step out onto a knife's edge. The stakes were not simply emotional heartbreak, they were exile, disgrace, and the irreversible shattering of the life you were born to lead. Close your eyes and let the noise of the modern world fade away. In the candle-lit silence, you hear the echo of distant church bells, the heavy clatter of hoofs on cobblestones, the muffled voices behind thick stone walls. Somewhere, a young girl stands in a drafty hall, her hands trembling as her father signs the parchment that will bind her to a stranger. A nobleman watches his beloved from across a crowded feast, knowing that even the gentlest word or passing glance could end in scandal. All around them, the eyes of 100 generations press in. Priests and parents, lords and ladies, servants and scribes, each one a silent witness to the forbidden. What made love such a dangerous thing? Why was the desire to share your life with another so feared, so strictly controlled, so endlessly policed? The answers lie in a world where marriage was rarely about happiness. Instead, it was a tool, a transaction, a chess piece in a family's endless quest for land, power, or security. Your destiny was decided long before you understood what it meant to dream of someone's touch. In a time ruled by inheritance, reputation, and strict social order, love threatened to upend the carefully stacked cards of society. And that kind of threat could not be tolerated. But the real story, the one that makes hearts beat faster across centuries, is not only about oppression. It is about resistance. The more love was outlawed, the more desperately people clung to it. Imagine knowing that a secret note, a whispered vow in a shadowy corridor, might be your only chance to speak the truth you feel inside. The greater the risk, the deeper the devotion grew. Forbidden love became not just an act of passion, but an act of rebellion, a dangerous hope that, even if everything else was taken, no law could govern the yearnings of the soul. This was a world of astonishing paradox. The same church that preached compassion and unity declared that any union unsanctioned by family or faith was a grave offense. A father's will or a king's signature held the weight of eternity. The closer two people drew together, the more perilous the path became. Some lovers paid in disgrace, others in a lifetime of separation.
And yet, again and again, they chose to love anyway. If you think today's romances are complicated, look closer at the world that came before us. Medieval lovers didn't just risk heartbreak, they risked everything. There are stories preserved in fading ink and crumbling stone, tales that have haunted the imagination for generations. Imagine a brilliant philosopher who lost everything for the student he adored, a young woman who gave up her name for the man she refused to betray, a queen who dared to rewrite the rules of power and affection. Imagine the silent courts of love, where ladies in silk and knights in armor debated the meaning of true devotion, or the shadowy streets of Verona, where two families' ancient grudge would become the backdrop for the most tragic vow in all of literature. Yet, the most astonishing part is that every story, each desperate choice, each impossible romance, helped to reshape the world we live in now. The rules of courtship, the idea that love is worth any sacrifice, the belief that two souls can find each other against impossible odds, all these dreams were born out of centuries of struggle, secrecy, and longing. Let's open the door and step together into a time when love was a perilous journey and every heartbeat could echo with danger. The stories you are about to discover are more than history. They are proof that even the strongest walls can be breached by the courage to care. This is not just a tale of punishments and betrayals, but of letters written in the dark, of hands joined in secret, of eyes that meet across a crowded hall and change two lives forever. These are the forbidden love stories of the Middle Ages, the ones they never wanted you to know, but that refuse to be forgotten. The flickering candlelight, the chill in the night air, the sound of distant voices plotting your fate. This is how it felt to fall in love, when love itself was the greatest crime. And in the next pages, as we travel deeper into these lost worlds, you will see why some people were willing to lose everything just for the chance to love and be loved in return. Imagine opening your eyes on your 14th birthday, not to the simple anticipation of cake or gifts, but to the slow realization that today your life may be mapped out forever. In medieval Europe, childhood was a brief prologue before the main act began, and the next scene was rarely written by your own hand. For most, especially those born into families with even the smallest sliver of land, nobility, or ambition, adolescence was a countdown to a contract, not a celebration. The moment you crossed the invisible line between child and marriageable asset, your fate was placed in the hands of those who valued strategy over sentiment, alliances over affection. Picture the world as it truly was, a tapestry woven not from dreams, but from the hard, practical fibers of survival. In the dim halls of stone keeps, parents negotiated over parchment and wine, discussing children as if they were chess pieces to be moved for the good of the lineage. You might have only glimpsed your intended partner in passing, their face as unfamiliar as the distant lands they called home. Yet, the day would arrive when a messenger would bring word, a date set, a dowry agreed, your life's direction changed forever with the stroke of a quill. The concept of marrying for love was so foreign that, if spoken aloud, it might earn only polite laughter or a stern warning. To many, marriage was a business transaction, a way to secure peace with a neighbor, merge farmlands, gain a title, or acquire much-needed allies in a world always teetering on the brink of war or famine. If you were a girl, your value lay in the connections your hand in marriage could bring. If you were a boy, the right match might secure your family's future for another generation. And so the young watched as their destinies were bartered away, quietly learning that wishes and hopes were luxuries for poets and minstrels, not for those burdened by duty. The pressure was relentless, and there was little room for rebellion. To refuse the partner chosen for you was to risk more than a few angry words. Families, driven by centuries-old expectations, could respond with threats, disinheritance, or banishment. There are records, detailed, chilling, of children sent away, hidden in distant convents or monasteries for daring to resist. More often, the resistance was crushed before it could even form. From the time you were old enough to understand, it was made clear. Happiness, if it came at all, was a bonus, never a requirement. Layered atop this system was the iron hand of the Church. The Catholic Church, stretching its influence into every village and household, held rigid beliefs about the purpose of marriage. Love, in the romantic sense, was viewed with suspicion, a potential distraction from duty and from God. Marriage, according to theologians like St. Augustine, was a necessary institution, primarily for producing legitimate heirs and forging alliances, secondarily for the regulation of human desire. Even within marriage, passion was to be carefully controlled. Anything that risked upsetting the balance of the world as the Church understood it was to be kept at bay. Priests became the silent arbiters of countless fates. Marriage was not simply a personal matter. It was a sacrament, and the Church's approval was needed at every step. In practice, this often meant that a marriage could be arranged and solemnized without the bride or groom's full knowledge or consent. Parents negotiated, priests blessed, and young lives shifted direction. If the union served a greater purpose, it was celebrated, regardless of the individual's feelings. The idea that a person might refuse a match for reasons of the heart seemed almost heretical. To be a child of this world was to grow up fast, learning to suppress hope in favor of endurance, to trade personal dreams for the practical needs of the family. And yet, beneath the surface of all this careful planning, something wild and unpredictable always threatened to break through. For every child resigned to their fate, another lay awake in the darkness, heart pounding with dreams they dared not voice. Even as society demanded obedience, the quiet longing for something more, for the chance to choose, to feel, to love, never completely disappeared. Every now and then, the rules would falter. Two young people might find themselves in a stolen moment, sharing a glance, a smile, a secret wish. They would know the cost of even the smallest rebellion, yet the risk only sharpened their desire. The legend of those who dared to want more, who tried to bend the chains that bound them, would echo in whispers through stone corridors and fire-lit chambers. Because in this world, where every choice seemed made in advance, the quiet yearning for freedom, for the impossible promise of love, was a spark that refused to die. And so the stories began. The stories of those who tried to write their own destinies, who challenged the system with nothing but hope and heart. Their struggles would shape history, leaving traces that outlasted any alliance or treaty. For in a world designed to keep people apart, it is the stories of those who risked everything for a chance at real connection that still capture our imaginations centuries later. In the stone-cold hierarchy of medieval life, there was no force more absolute than the authority of family. Blood ties bound tighter than iron chains, and the will of parents, especially fathers, could shape or shatter a future with a single command. The family was not simply a circle of kin, but an institution, a living legacy, a careful investment in survival. To defy that legacy was to invite a storm, the likes of which few could withstand. Imagine for a moment the courage it took to resist. You are a daughter who has met another's eyes across a market square, a son who has tasted laughter with someone far outside the carefully guarded gates of your house. Yet even as your feelings grow, so too does the shadow of your family's expectations. Every stolen glance, every exchanged word, carries the possibility of ruin. In this world, obedience was the only currency that mattered. To step beyond it was to risk becoming an outcast, not just in your own home, but in the eyes of everyone you had ever known. Records from the courts of medieval Europe are filled with the chilling consequences that awaited those who dared to love without permission. The drama did not play out in quiet sadness. It erupted in scandal, public disgrace, and punishments designed to serve as warnings for generations. Legal documents, faded with age but sharp with detail, tell of young men disinherited for secret marriages, daughters locked away in convents, lovers separated by force and by distance, sometimes never to meet again. Consider the story of a young woman in 13th century France whose family discovered her secret correspondence with a man of lower birth. The discovery was a catastrophe. The letters, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, became evidence in a public trial that ended with her being sent to a distant nunnery. There, surrounded by strangers and forbidden even to write, she spent her days in silence. Her lover, stripped of any support, was driven from his home, left to wander a world that had no place for him. Their only crime was believing they might belong to themselves. But such stories were not rare. In the archives of Verona, the tragic chronicles of families divided by political hatred and personal choice resurface again and again. There are records of fathers who demanded that sons fight duels to restore the family's honor, of mothers who pleaded with daughters to abandon the only happiness they'd ever known. When private persuasion failed, public intervention followed. Sometimes the law was called in not as a shield, but as a weapon, a tool for enforcing family will when softer methods failed. Punishments could be severe, often shockingly so. Young men who married without their parents' approval might find themselves stripped of their inheritance, forced into servitude, or even branded as criminals. In England, legal texts describe bastardizing the children of such unions, declaring them illegitimate and forever denying them the privileges of birth. For daughters, the fate was often isolation. Locked behind monastery walls, their only visitors silent nuns and their own regret. There were other subtler forms of retribution as well. Families wielded shame as expertly as any sword. To be disowned was not just to lose material wealth, but to be erased from the story of your people, your name spoken only in whispers as a warning to others. For those who had grown up in a world where family was everything, this was a kind of living oblivion, a punishment with no appeal. And yet, despite the weight of these consequences, defiance was never completely stamped out. The records, for all their tales of ruin, also speak of the astonishing courage it took to love against all odds. Some stories end in tragedy, others in escape and reinvention. There are fragments of hope. A young couple who, discovering that they would be separated, ran away together and started new lives in a distant city, living in obscurity but side by side. Another pair found refuge with sympathetic clergy who, risking their own positions, performed secret marriages in candlelit chapels.
What drove these people to such extremes? For some, it was the simple refusal to accept a future written by someone else's hand. For others, it was the irresistible conviction that true connection, however fleeting, was worth any cost. The courts may have handed down sentences, but the heart found its own defenses. Coded language, midnight meetings, rings exchanged in secret as proof of vows never to be broken. Over time, the sheer volume of these stories began to shift the boundaries of the possible. Whispered tales of lovers who risked everything traveled from village to village, slowly undermining the notion that duty alone could guarantee happiness or stability. The power of family remained immense, but its limits became clearer with every act of resistance. Each time a boundary was crossed,
Each time a forbidden romance was carved into the margins of the official record, another crack appeared in the old order. Thus, the price of disobedience was high, sometimes unbearably so. But for those who dared to risk it all, even the threat of isolation, shame, or poverty could not quite eclipse the hope that love, somehow, might still find a way. Their struggles, carved in court records and immortalized in song, would become the foundation of stories that resonate even today, long after the halls where those first secrets were whispered have faded to dust. There is a curious, undeniable paradox at the core of human nature. The moment something is forbidden, our desire for it sharpens, even when every rational thought tells us to turn away. This impulse is as ancient as the first stories ever whispered by firelight. A child reaching for the jar they've been warned to leave untouched. A lover aching for a touch made perilous by watchful eyes. In the rigid world of medieval Europe, where so much was circumscribed by law, custom, and religious authority, the forbidden did not shrink out of fear. It blossomed, all the more enticing precisely because it was dangerous. Medieval chroniclers may never have heard of modern psychology, yet their stories brim with evidence of what scholars today call reactance. This is the phenomenon where the more we are told no, the more powerfully we crave yes. When a young woman learned that speaking to a certain knight would mean disgrace, her thoughts drifted to him in spite of herself. When a nobleman's parents warned him never to look upon a servant girl, her image became impossible to erase. The boundaries drawn by others did not merely serve to contain passion, they stoked it, fueling a fire that burned hotter for its concealment.
Why does this happen? Modern thinkers have spent decades studying what medieval lovers simply felt. Reactance arises when our freedom feels threatened, even in small, seemingly trivial matters. Denial of choice feels like an attack on the very core of who we are. The heart rebels, sometimes quietly and sometimes with reckless abandon. In an era where nearly all of life was arranged, your work, your faith, your spouse, the forbidden became the last frontier of selfhood, a secret space no rule could completely govern. Nowhere was this more visible than in the clandestine language of medieval romance. The rules were clear. Marriages must be arranged, courtships observed, reputations protected at all costs. Yet, the more impossible the union, the more elaborate the rituals of secret longing became. Lovers invented entire codes to disguise their feelings. They exchanged flowers whose meanings only the two of them understood. A sprig of rosemary for remembrance, a violet for hidden faithfulness. Some risked everything to pass notes in the margins of religious texts, or to brush fingertips in the dark shadow of a chapel. A glance that would mean little in a freer world became an unspoken promise, a risk as thrilling as it was small. Even the church's most dire warnings could not stamp out these yearnings. When religious authorities declared that certain desires were sinful, people found ways to pursue them anyway, sometimes in the shadows, sometimes in defiance. One might slip away from a crowded hall to meet in a moonlit courtyard. Another might carve initials into the bark of an ancient tree, hoping that some part of their secret would outlast the threat of discovery. Each act of rebellion, however small, reinforced the sensation that what was forbidden had value beyond words. These patterns repeated themselves again and again, crossing barriers of class, faith, and distance. The son of a blacksmith, forbidden from seeing the merchant's daughter, would wait for hours just to glimpse her through an open window. A young novice in a convent, told to extinguish all earthly longing, might find herself writing prayers that gradually shift from praise to poetry. The rules, meant to smother passion, became the very reason it refused to die. Psychologists today understand that the human mind attaches heightened emotional meaning to obstacles. The struggle itself, the very fact that love is risky, hidden, or dangerous, infuses it with energy and focus. To yearn for what cannot be easily had is to feel alive, to discover the depth of one's own heart. Medieval people, for all their faith and obedience, were no different. If anything, the walls that surrounded them only made their passions more intense.
The effect rippled through generations. Songs were written about impossible love. Tales were passed down about lovers who risked everything and paid dearly for it. These stories were not meant only as warnings, but also as quiet celebrations of courage. In a world that demanded conformity, the forbidden became a symbol of individuality, a mark of those rare souls willing to reach beyond what was allowed. Sometimes the cost was heartbreak. Sometimes, rarely, it was happiness found at last. But always, the desire for the forbidden, no matter the outcome, left an imprint that would shape not just lives, but the very fabric of culture. Medieval Europe tried to build walls around the heart, but in the end, it only made that heart beat stronger, echoing through time with the promise that the most precious dreams are often those that seem just out of reach. In a medieval world obsessed with order, the boundaries of class were as rigid as castle walls, and crossing them for love was not simply a breach of etiquette, it was a challenge to the foundation of society itself. From the highest throne room to the humblest cottage, everyone knew their place, and every custom, law, and sermon worked tirelessly to maintain that fragile hierarchy. At the top, kings and queens ruled by what they believed to be divine right. Below them, layers of nobility guarded ancient privileges, while the vast sea of peasants and townsfolk toiled, supporting the weight of the world above. And woven through it all was an unspoken promise: if everyone played their part, order would hold. But what happened when the heart refused to obey? When a noblewoman's eyes lingered too long on a stable boy, or a merchant's son fell for a kitchen maid, the simple act of longing could ripple outward, threatening scandal, shame, or even chaos. These were not just private indiscretions, they were crimes against the natural order, and both church and state conspired to keep love in its proper place. The logic was as cold as it was relentless. If bloodlines became tangled, if titles and property were inherited by the wrong hands, society itself might unravel. The punishment for those who dared to defy these boundaries was often swift and harsh. For noble families, the greatest fear was not loss of fortune, but loss of face, a stain on the family name that could linger for generations. Should a daughter of rank marry beneath her station, her kin might denounce her, strip her of inheritance, and send her into exile. Sometimes she would vanish behind the walls of a distant convent, her story buried along with her hopes. The young men who risked such matches could expect little mercy. Peasants who courted noblewomen were labeled as upstarts, accused of insolence, and punished as criminals, flogged, imprisoned, or worse. But the records reveal that love was rarely deterred by these threats. Time and again, families found themselves blindsided by secrets hidden in plain sight. Servants and masters who carried on forbidden romances under the noses of watchful parents. Merchants' daughters smuggling letters to wandering minstrels. Young nobles disguising themselves to meet their beloveds in the market square. These secret worlds thrived in shadows, protected, sometimes, by networks of friends or sympathetic clergy willing to risk complicity for the sake of true feeling. Still, the consequences for discovery could be life-altering. Legal documents tell of marriages declared invalid by royal decree, of children born to such unions declared illegitimate and denied their parents' names. In England, France, and the German principalities, kings issued proclamations forbidding unions across class lines. To enforce these rules, agents of the crown kept lists of suspicious households and questioned anyone rumored to harbor inappropriate guests. The threat of public disgrace was wielded as a weapon, and families would go to extraordinary lengths to erase any hint of scandal from the record. Yet there are stories, hidden but never quite erased, of couples who chose love over safety and paid a terrible price. One such story tells of Margaret, a high-born lady in the court of Edward I, and Thomas, a humble groom. Their love unfolded over 3 years, concealed by careful planning and the complicity of loyal servants. When it was finally discovered, Thomas was cast out of England, forced to leave everything he had ever known. Margaret, stripped of her land and title, chose to follow him into exile rather than renounce their bond. Their lives were changed forever, but the simple act of choosing each other in the face of so much risk would echo through history as an act of breathtaking defiance. Other tales, preserved in monastery records and dusty chronicles, tell of secret unions between monks and serving girls, between merchant sons and noble daughters. Some were discovered and punished, others slipped through the cracks, living quietly on the margins of society, their children growing up in ambiguity. The world rarely forgave them, but within those tiny, hidden spaces, a different kind of order flourished, one built on trust, daring, and the hope that love could, for a moment, rewrite the rules.
Why did people take such risks? Perhaps because, when everything else was arranged and decided from birth, choosing whom to love became the last, greatest act of rebellion. In crossing the invisible lines drawn by kings and priests, medieval lovers asserted something dangerously modern, that the worth of a human heart could not be measured in coin, blood, or title. And so, while society did its best to hold the world in place, the quiet resistance of those who loved beyond their station chipped away at the foundations, one stolen kiss at a time. The threat of punishment could never quite extinguish the hope that somewhere beyond the walls a different life was waiting, one where love, not lineage, would decide the fate of two souls. Inside the silent stone corridors of the medieval monastery, the air is heavy with a devotion so absolute it often borders on fear. Candles flicker before ancient icons, prayers echo along the cloisters, and behind thick wooden doors, men and women live lives shaped by ritual and obedience. Yet beneath the surface of this order, beneath the embroidered robes, the ringing of church bells, and the careful recitation of scripture, another current runs quietly, powerful and unspoken, the restless longing of the heart. The Church in medieval Europe was the architect of souls, its authority stretching from the cradle to the grave. It preached that the purest life was one lived in service to God, free of worldly distraction. Nowhere was this ideal more rigorously enforced than within the monastery or convent, where men and women took solemn vows, poverty, obedience, and above all, chastity. In the eyes of church leaders, desire for another person was a temptation, a distraction from the divine, and one of the greatest spiritual dangers a soul could face. To surrender to passion was to risk your very salvation. For centuries, theologians debated the place of love and desire. Augustine and his followers warned that romantic attachment, even within marriage, might lure the faithful away from their spiritual path. Lust was to be tamed, even suppressed, and for those who could not, the cloister offered a refuge from temptation. In this world, longing was treated like a disease to be cured, not a joy to be savored.
But monasteries and convents were not simply prisons for the heart. Paradoxically, they were often places where the most passionate souls were gathered. Within their walls lived scholars, poets, and dreamers, people whose capacity for feeling could not be fully erased by the recitation of prayers.
For every monk who found peace in solitude, there was another whose mind wandered during midnight vigils, haunted by memories of a lover's voice or the ghost of a dream left behind. For every nun who found purpose in service, another stared through the grate at moonlit gardens, imagining a world beyond the iron bars. The daily rituals left little room for private longing, but the human spirit is nothing if not inventive. There are records, carefully hidden yet impossible to suppress, of love blossoming in the most unlikely places. Monks who slipped away from their cells to write poetry for the novices in the scriptorium. Nuns who, forbidden from speaking openly, found ways to communicate through coded embroidery or the passing of secret notes during morning prayers. These connections, though seldom physical, often grew into bonds of astonishing depth, an intimacy forged by the very rules that forbade it. To fall in love within the cloister was to court not only scandal, but disaster. Punishments for those discovered ranged from public penance and fasting to expulsion and isolation. In rare, infamous cases, forbidden desire was met with even harsher fates: forced silence, exile to distant monasteries, or lifelong confinement. The Church's records are full of stories that end in heartbreak, novices separated from each other and from the only life they had known, monks forbidden ever to write or receive letters again. Yet, the very severity of the rules sometimes created a space where forbidden love could flourish in secrecy. Lovers became experts at misdirection, turning the language of prayer into veiled confessions, using shared rituals as a way to exchange meaningful glances. Even acts of piety could become expressions of devotion, as a nun might dedicate a psalm to her beloved, or a monk illuminate a manuscript with hidden symbols that only one other person could understand. But the reality was never only suffering. For some, the structure of monastic life brought unexpected freedom. Women, especially, who entered convents sometimes found an escape from the relentless pressure of marriage and childbirth, a place where their intellect and creativity were finally valued. Here, they became scholars, writers, and healers, leaving behind a legacy of letters and learning that still inspires awe. Still, even as the walls protected, they also confined. The longing that could not be spoken often found its way into the songs and poems of the age, into stories of saints and martyrs who risked everything for love. Tales spread of monks and nuns whose hearts could not be tamed by doctrine alone, who dared to care in a world that told them caring was a weakness. These stories echoed from cloister to village and back again, whispered reminders that no vow, however sacred, could ever fully silence the pulse of human desire. And so the monastery became a paradox, a place both of exile and of secret hope. Behind every act of devotion lay the faint shadow of longing, proof that the soul's deepest needs could not be washed away by ritual or erased by commandment. Even here, in the heart of faith's strongest fortress, love continued to grow, quiet, determined, and impossibly resilient. When the world conspires to keep hearts apart, human creativity rises to meet the challenge. In medieval Europe, where love was policed at every turn and the mere suspicion of affection could spell ruin, people became masters of subtlety. The strictest prohibitions, intended to stamp out desire, instead transformed ordinary men and women into poets, strategists, and inventors of secret languages. It was as if the more tightly love was caged, the more fiercely its flame burned, seeking any crack through which to flicker into life. Imagine a noblewoman, watched day and night, unable to exchange so much as a whispered word with the man she loves. How does she let him know her heart beats for him alone? In a world where even a glance could be perilous, she turns to the silent language of flowers. A single violet, placed in the path of her beloved, tells him of her faithfulness. A sprig of rosemary, tucked into a book, signals remembrance.
Every bloom has a meaning, every bouquet a message, understood only by those who share in its code. These small, fragrant gestures became the secret conversations of a generation, a language rooted in nature but cultivated in defiance. The same ingenuity shaped written words. Love letters, forbidden outright or intercepted by family and clergy, became marvels of cryptic invention. Some couples developed private ciphers, substituting letters for numbers or weaving messages through the first letter of every line, acrostics that spelled out names or secret pledges. In the monasteries, monks and nuns bent the rules of scripture itself, embedding hidden pleas for connection within religious texts. Margins were filled with invisible ink, the juice of onions or lemons revealing tender phrases only when held to the warmth of a candle flame.
Pages that appeared to praise God might, when read the right way, tell of longing and hope, all under the noses of those most determined to prevent it. Not all codes were written. Lovers learned to communicate with simple objects: a ribbon tied 3 times around a wrist, a carved token left on a chapel pew, a particular way of folding a handkerchief. Even everyday interactions were repurposed: a phrase repeated at dinner, a certain melody played on the lute, the slow tracing of a pattern on a dusty window pane. All could serve as clandestine declarations, passing by unnoticed by the uninitiated, but carrying worlds of meaning to the one for whom they were intended. The physical world became an accomplice. Gardens were planted with secret intent, paths winding through groves of flowers whose selection told stories only the couple could interpret. Jewelry was crafted to open, revealing miniature portraits or scraps of poetry. Cloaks were embroidered on the inside with initials, and rings were inscribed with lines visible only to the wearer. The more society tried to confine, the more imaginative the rebellion became. Even the constraints of daily life offered opportunities. In the great halls and crowded markets, there was safety in numbers. Eyes met across rooms. Hands brushed fleetingly among the crowd. During feasts or festivals, when tradition allowed for masks and costumes, true feelings could be expressed under the cover of anonymity. Masquerades became sanctuaries, spaces where, for a few hours, roles could be reversed and secrets safely whispered behind silk and velvet. For those whose love was truly impossible, secrecy was a matter of survival. Their world was full of locked doors and vigilant chaperones, but they found ways to bridge the distance. The sound of a particular bell at midnight might be a signal to meet in a chapel. A certain candle left burning in a window, a promise that all was well. Lovers mapped out their days in signs and symbols, creating a world within a world, invisible to all but themselves. These elaborate rituals and codes did more than preserve relationships. They added layers of depth and excitement, turning each act of communication into an adventure. Every successful exchange, every hidden note, became a victory over the forces of control. For many, the very difficulty of these secretive connections made them more precious. The danger, the cleverness required, the constant awareness of risk, all heightened the thrill, making love not only sweeter but stronger.
In the end, the more society sought to imprison desire, the more ingenious its expressions became. Through flowers, riddles, and rituals, medieval lovers created a hidden language that survives in echoes even today, a testament to the truth that passion, once kindled, is almost impossible to silence. Where walls were built, the heart learned to send its message through the smallest cracks, proving again and again that even in the darkest of ages, love would always find a way. Paris in the 12th century was a city in the making, its narrow lanes alive with the sound of debate and construction. Notre Dame's towers were still climbing toward the sky, and in the echoing halls of cathedrals and schools, ideas leapt like sparks between minds hungry for meaning.
the city hummed with an electricity that belonged not only to stone and scaffolding, but to the fierce excitement of thought itself. And into this world of questions and challenge stepped two of the brightest minds of their generation, Peter Abelard and Heloise, whose love would soon become legend, whispered for centuries as both a warning and a wonder. Abelard was already a star. Charismatic, sharp-witted, and fiercely independent, he drew students from across Europe, all eager to witness his unorthodox approach to philosophy. He questioned everything, from the logic of Aristotle to the tenets of the Church, inviting admiration and scandal in equal measure. His lectures filled the air with boldness and possibility, and among his followers, his reputation was that of a man who could reshape the way a person thought, or even who they were. It was only a matter of time before his path crossed with Heloise. She was the niece of Canon Fulbert, a respected official in the Parisian church, but more than that, she was a prodigy, a young woman fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, gifted with a mind as restless and brilliant as any man's. Her poetry was whispered about in scholarly circles, her wit the subject of both admiration and anxiety among those who believed such intellect had no place in a woman. Even in an age unkind to female ambition, Heloise had carved out a small space for her gifts, and those who knew her recognized that something extraordinary simmered beneath her calm surface. Fulbert, hoping to refine his niece's education and perhaps curb its more rebellious edges, invited Abelard to become her tutor. The arrangement was, on its surface, perfect, the greatest scholar of his day instructing the city's most promising mind. But beneath the practicalities, a different current stirred. Abelard himself would later write of his first meeting with Heloise, recalling not just her beauty, but the clear, direct gaze that seemed to pierce straight to the heart of things. Their lessons began with Aristotle and St. Augustine, but the boundaries of logic soon dissolved, giving way to something richer and far more dangerous.
In the privacy of Fulbert's library, surrounded by centuries of wisdom, they talked long into the evening. What started as intellectual sparring, arguments over philosophy, religion, literature, slowly became something else. The thrill of debate was matched by the thrill of being truly seen, not as a curiosity or a student, but as an equal. To Heloise, Abelard was a mind she could finally meet without restraint. To Abelard, Heloise was a revelation, not just a pupil, but a partner in every sense. Their connection deepened with every passing day, transforming the dusty confines of scholarship into a stage for the most exquisite kind of courtship. In a world where arranged marriages and silent obedience were the norm, theirs was a bond forged first through intellect and only then through passion. Words became caresses. Letters slipped between books carried confessions that no chaperone could overhear. They reveled in the joy of matching each other's wit. Each challenge met with a sharper reply, each question an invitation to go deeper. Yet, even as their hearts drew closer, the danger was impossible to ignore. Abelard was bound by his own vows, informal perhaps, but real enough to make any scandal a catastrophe. Heloise's reputation, delicately balanced atop Fulbert's ambitions, could collapse at the slightest hint of impropriety. The line between teacher and student was not just social, but sacred, and to cross it was to risk everything both had worked so hard to achieve. Still, the flame once kindled could not be hidden for long. As autumn turned to winter, their private world grew bolder. Their discussions lingered later into the night, the topics shifting from logic to longing, from faith to hope. They found themselves inventing excuses to spend time alone, lingering in doorways and beneath archways, drawn back again and again by a force neither could name. The boundaries of propriety blurred until they vanished entirely.
replaced by the secret understanding that something miraculous, perhaps even dangerous, was unfolding between them. The city outside remained oblivious, its rhythms unchanged. But within the small, lamplit rooms where Abelard and Heloise met, the world was being remade. Their love was not the naive infatuation of youth, nor the weary compromise of arranged marriage. It was a collision of equals, fiery, complicated, full of risk. In each other, they found not just passion, but a sense of destiny, a recognition that theirs was a story meant to challenge the expectations of an age. As their feelings deepened, so too did the shadows that gathered around them. What began as an intellectual revolution was becoming a personal rebellion, one that could not remain hidden forever. But in those early days, before betrayal and consequence, Abelard and Heloise lived for a while in a rare golden light, the kind that history would forever remember, even as it prepared to cast them into darkness.
Within the sanctuary of Fulbert's book-lined study, something rare unfolded between Abelard and Heloise, a dance of minds so electric it was destined to set their hearts ablaze. Their first conversations were measured and formal, the classic exchange between tutor and student, Aristotle's logic, Augustine's theology, the problems of universals, the nature of good and evil. Abelard, with his quick wit and razor-sharp intellect, challenged Heloise with questions intended to test her limits. To his surprise, she not only met them, but sometimes surpassed them, answering in ways that twisted old arguments into dazzling new shapes. The boundaries between teacher and pupil began to dissolve, their roles shifting fluidly with each encounter. For Heloise, the thrill was not simply in learning, but in being allowed, at last, to think freely, to ask questions that would have been dismissed or punished in any other setting. Abelard did not patronize her or seek to confine her to the narrow expectations of her gender. Instead, he invited her to question everything, even him. Their conversations became a laboratory of possibility, a space where intellect was celebrated, not suppressed. In a world that so often demanded silence, this was a liberation, a heady, intoxicating freedom that drew them ever closer. As the weeks passed, the line between philosophy and feeling grew perilously thin. Their debates became longer, the topics veering from logic to literature, from scripture to poetry, and from poetry to the subtle art of living. When Heloise challenged Abelard on matters of faith, he found himself not defensive, but delighted. When he pointed out a flaw in her reasoning, she argued back with fire and humor. Every encounter left them both a little breathless, as if the true subject of their arguments was never simply the words, but the question of who might win the other's heart. It was in these moments, when laughter broke through the solemnity, when a quiet compliment slipped through the armor of intellect, that the first seeds of desire took root. Yet it was never a simple, mindless passion. Their bond was forged in the crucible of mutual respect, every glance and word charged with meaning. Abelard later confessed that it was Heloise's mind that captivated him first, and her beauty, while remarkable, was only the outward sign of the brilliance he had already come to treasure. Heloise, in turn, found in Abelard not just a teacher, but a companion, someone willing to meet her gaze without flinching, to treat her ideas as worthy of attention.
Each lesson became an excuse to linger, each debate an opportunity for intimacy. As autumn faded into winter, they spent long hours in the flickering light, speaking in low voices so as not to disturb the household, or perhaps so as not to break the spell between them. They wrote poems to one another in Latin, embedding secret meanings in every line. Abelard would sometimes bring Heloise a rare book, or a line of verse copied out in his careful hand, the gift of shared thought more precious than gold. But even as their relationship deepened,
The danger was always present. Theirs was a connection that could not exist in the open. Abelard was Heloise's tutor, a man whose reputation rested on discipline and intellect. She was the protected niece of a powerful church official, whose future depended on her virtue and her obedience. Every stolen moment was shadowed by the possibility of discovery. Still, neither could bring themselves to turn away. They were like travelers standing at the edge of a precipice, aware of the risk, but unable to deny the irresistible pull of the view beyond. Their secret world grew richer, and with each new confidence exchanged, their feelings intensified. The passion that flared between them was a product of their minds as much as their hearts, a rare chemistry that neither had ever known before. They reveled in the discovery that intellectual challenge could be as intoxicating as any physical touch, that the act of being truly known and understood was itself a kind of seduction. It was as if the world outside, its rules, its expectations, its dangers, had faded away, leaving only the charged space between two souls unafraid to meet as equals. Over time, the inevitability of their love became impossible to deny. What began as an experiment in philosophy had become something far more dangerous and precious, a union of minds that would, inevitably, ignite into a union of hearts. The library, once a sanctuary of learning, became a stage for their secret courtship. Every book a witness, every page a confidant. Through wit and wonder, longing and laughter, Abelard and Heloise invented a new kind of romance, one where reason and feeling, intellect and passion could exist together, forging a bond strong enough to withstand the tempests yet to come. For nearly a year, Abelard and Heloise sustained their delicate dance, a secret world built on whispered confidences, shadowed glances, and stolen hours behind closed doors. They became masters of discretion, their love camouflaged as lessons and scholarly debate, each meeting carefully choreographed to avoid suspicion. Yet passion, no matter how cleverly disguised, has a way of making itself known. It lingers in a lingering touch, a shared smile, a slip in composure when others are near. And in the tightly knit world of Fulbert's household, even the smallest misstep could not remain hidden forever. The unraveling began, as it so often does, with a simple, ordinary moment. A servant lingered in the hallway, overhearing laughter that did not sound like teacher and pupil. Fulbert's gaze, sharp and increasingly uneasy, began to follow the pair, seeking evidence for the uneasy feeling that had begun to gnaw at him. Neighbors whispered about the philosopher's frequent visits, the hours spent in the library long after lessons should have ended. The house grew tense with secrets, every creak of the floorboards a possible betrayal. Then the inevitable happened. One morning, Heloise confided in Abelard a truth too urgent to hide. She was expecting a child. The realization electrified the air with hope and terror in equal measure. This secret could not be contained within books or buried beneath scholarship. It was a living, undeniable fact, one that could shatter reputations, destroy futures, and bring scandal crashing down on all their heads. Abelard, ever the strategist, acted quickly. He arranged for Heloise to leave Paris and take refuge with his own family in Brittany, safely away from Fulbert's reach. There, in secrecy, she gave birth to their son, a baby boy they named Astrolabe, a name chosen not for tradition, but for the instrument that guided explorers to new worlds, a fitting symbol for a child born of such forbidden daring. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Perhaps, with time and caution, their union might escape the full force of public wrath. But Fulbert was not so easily deceived. He soon learned the truth, and with it, the weight of his humiliation grew unbearable. In the world he inhabited, a man's honor was a currency more precious than gold, and to have been so deceived, under his own roof, by the very man he had trusted, was an insult he could neither forgive nor ignore. Betrayal, when it comes from those closest, cuts the deepest. The rumors in Paris quickly escalated, and what was once a private matter became fodder for public gossip and ecclesiastical concern.
Faced with mounting pressure, Abelard proposed what he believed to be a solution: a secret marriage. In the dead of night, far from curious eyes, Abelard and Heloise became husband and wife. Yet even in this, there could be no peace. Heloise herself, wary of the consequences for both Abelard's reputation and her own, hesitated. She knew that such a marriage, conducted without Fulbert's blessing and concealed from the world, could only inflame the scandal if discovered. And discovered it was. Fulbert, feeling not relief but further humiliation at the secret union, saw in Abelard's actions only proof of treachery. The city's whispering grew into shouts. Gossip ricocheted from scholar to priest, from neighbor to noble. In the eyes of Paris, the brilliant philosopher was now a villain, the gifted niece a fallen woman. Once celebrated for their intellect and promise, Abelard and Heloise became examples of what happens when ambition and desire overstep their bounds. Then one night, vengeance arrived. Fulbert, unable to restore his honor by mere words or admonishments, arranged for a group of men to break into Abelard's quarters as he slept. What followed was an act so brutal it shocked even a society accustomed to harsh justice. Abelard was physically attacked and left irreversibly marked, a warning to any who would dare repeat his offense. The violence shattered their lives, scattering them to different worlds. Abelard, now physically and socially diminished, retreated into the shadows of the church, his days of public teaching and debate over in an instant. Heloise, her future in ruins, entered a convent, sacrificing any hope of an ordinary life for the fragile promise of Abelard's safety and reputation. Their son was sent away, to be raised in secrecy by distant relatives. The scandal echoed through Paris, transforming what had been a private rebellion into a tragedy played out before all of society. Once they had been models of intellect and promise. Now they were emblems of warning, their story used to caution others against the perils of defiance. The punishment extended far beyond flesh and blood. It reached into reputation, ambition, love itself, reminding all who watched that in this world, the cost of forbidden passion could be ruin on a scale no one could have imagined. Yet, even as the world condemned them, the connection between Abelard and Heloise did not die. Their love, forced from the daylight, would take on a new form, one that would defy the limits of body and circumstance, a testament to what can survive even after everything else has been stripped away. The night that shattered Abelard's life reverberated far beyond the stone walls where it took place. It was not just a personal tragedy, but a public reckoning, a moment when private desire collided with the full force of social order, leaving nothing untouched. In the wake of the brutal attack, Abelard awoke to a new existence marked by both physical loss and the cruel certainty that he could never reclaim the life he had known. The cost of love, so eagerly embraced in secret, had come due in the harshest possible currency. For Abelard, the aftermath was more than pain. It was a spiritual and intellectual catastrophe. Once the darling of Paris's intellectual elite, he now became an object of pity, mockery, and sometimes fear. His body, once animated by the confidence of a teacher, now seemed only a reminder of what had been taken from him. To many, his fate was not just retribution, but a chilling cautionary tale, an example of what befell those who dared to set themselves above the rules. Invitations vanished, students drifted away. His once brilliant career crumbled,
leaving him to wander the periphery of a world that had once hung on his every word. Yet, perhaps the greater punishment was internal. Abelard, so often guided by reason and wit, was left to grapple with a sense of failure, both as a man and as a protector. He could do nothing to shield Heloise from the consequences of their passion, nothing to undo the suffering his love had brought her. It was a torment that no philosophy could soothe, no prayer could dispel. He sought refuge in the church, taking vows that would remove him even further from the life he had imagined. The monastery offered silence, anonymity, and penance, a cell for the mind as much as for the body. For Heloise, the consequences were equally profound. In a world that demanded a woman's purity as the price for her future, her fate was sealed not by her own choice, but by the vengeance others enacted on her behalf. She entered the convent at Abelard's urging, a sacrifice made not out of faith, but out of love, a promise to protect him, to erase herself from the world's reproach so that he might be spared further ruin. It was a choice that demanded the impossible, to renounce the very future she had longed for, the life she had risked everything to create. The convent, for all its rituals and prayers, became for Heloise both a refuge and a prison. She threw herself into study, rising quickly to become an abbess, her intellect now devoted to theology, administration, and the nurturing of other lost souls. Outwardly, she became a model of piety and discipline. Yet inside, her heart was a battlefield. The world expected her to let go of Abelard, to accept her fate with humility and silence. But Heloise was not made for quiet resignation. She wrestled with her vows, torn between her longing and her loyalty, between the dictates of religion and the memory of passion. Their separation was more than physical, it was a test of spirit. Each bore the wounds of their love in different ways. Abelard in the loss of his identity, Heloise in the relentless demands of sacrifice. Letters became their only connection, a lifeline tossed across the abyss. In their correspondence, they poured out their anguish, their longing, their regrets, and their hopes. The world might have punished them, but in ink and parchment, they remained true to the selves that first found one another in a city of scholars and secrets. Yet society was not content simply to punish, it sought to erase. Their story was whispered in monasteries and convents, cited in sermons and warnings. They became the cautionary figures invoked by parents and priests. See what happens to those who place desire above duty, feeling above faith. But for every warning, there was also a faint note of awe, a grudging recognition of the strength it took to risk and endure so much for love. The price Abelard and Heloise paid was greater than any could have imagined when first they met in Fulbert's library. It was measured not only in pain and exile, but in the relentless pressure to surrender their truth. And yet, in their defiance and their suffering, they became something more than tragic lovers. They became a testament to the enduring power of the human heart, a reminder that sometimes the willingness to risk everything is itself a kind of victory, even when the world calls it defeat. Separated by walls, vows, and the judgments of an entire society, Abelard and Heloise found themselves exiled to distant worlds. He to the silence of monastic life, she to the cloistered routines of the convent. Yet even as fate denied them the closeness of ordinary lovers, it opened another path, the extraordinary intimacy of the written word. In a time when physical reunion was all but impossible, their letters became a bridge, defying distance and disaster, forging a connection that would echo long after the ink had faded. It began with a single message. Abelard, racked by guilt and longing, reaching out across the years to the woman whose absence haunted his days and nights. Heloise, in turn, answered not as a passive sufferer, but as his equal, her mind undimmed by hardship,
her affection undiminished by time. What unfolded between them in these letters was not simply an exchange of pleasantries or platitudes, but a conversation that roamed the entire landscape of love and loss, memory and hope, faith and doubt. In their correspondence, Abelard and Heloise stripped away every pretense. They wrote of regret, of longing, of the agony of remembering what could never be restored. They confessed their fears and failures, the moments of despair that threatened to consume them. But their letters were also alive with defiance, a refusal to let circumstance define the truth of what they had shared. Heloise, especially, refused to let the world's condemnation silence her heart. She challenged Abelard again and again, questioning not only his choices, but the very nature of love itself. Did true affection require sacrifice? Could faith and passion ever coexist, or were they destined always to tear each other apart? These were not idle musings, but fierce debates, carried out with the same intellectual fire that had first drawn them together. Abelard, whose life had been broken by violence and shame, searched for meaning in theology and philosophy, seeking a logic that might make sense of suffering. Heloise, for her part, demanded honesty, not just from him, but from herself. She confessed that even within the convent's rigid peace, her heart belonged to Abelard still, her longing as sharp as ever, undimmed by years of solitude. Their letters shimmered with contradictions, grief and gratitude, bitterness and hope, anger and tenderness, all woven together in a dialogue that was both raw and luminous. Separated by duty, they became closer than ever, their words bearing the secrets that even shared rooms might have left hidden. Each page carried the imprint of personalities too powerful to be suppressed by circumstance. They did not pretend to forget or to forgive easily, but neither did they surrender to despair. Again and again, they returned to the memory of that first intellectual spark, the knowledge that in each other they had found a mind and a soul unlike any other. Over time, their correspondence became more than personal comfort. It was a philosophical exploration, a questioning of the very foundations of love and suffering. Abelard sought meaning in redemption, reflecting on the ways hardship could shape the soul. Heloise, less convinced by dogma, clung to the living memory of their bond, refusing to believe that a love so profound could ever truly be condemned. Together, they wrote a new kind of story, not one of physical reunion, but of spiritual partnership, a relationship carried forward not by touch, but by thought and memory. It is in these letters that Abelard and Heloise achieved their greatest victory. Where society saw only scandal and ruin, their words preserved the best of what they had been: honesty, courage, and an unwavering belief in the power of human connection. Through parchment and ink, their love became immortal, an example for generations to come of how, even when everything else is lost, the heart's truth can still endure. Centuries later, their letters remain, the voice of longing and intellect echoing from the past. They remind us that while the world can destroy almost anything, reputation, opportunity, even hope itself, it cannot erase the mark left by a love that refuses to be forgotten. In their distance, Abelard and Heloise discovered a new form of closeness, one that would outlast every exile, every silence, every rule meant to keep them apart. Their story, preserved in the fragile lines of ink and parchment, became eternal, not in spite of suffering, but because of it. In the tapestry of medieval history, so often woven with the names of kings, popes, and knights, there are rare figures whose presence shatters expectation, reshaping the very fabric of their world. One such figure was Eleanor of Aquitaine,
a woman whose will and wit would leave an indelible mark on the centuries that followed. Her story begins not in shadow or secrecy, but at the heart of power. And yet her life would come to symbolize the possibility of love and independence in an age determined to deny both. Eleanor's childhood was a world away from the silent cloisters that trapped so many women of her time. Born into the most illustrious court in Western Europe, she inherited not only the rich, sunlit lands of Aquitaine, but also a culture steeped in poetry, music, and the subtle arts of diplomacy. Here, a woman was expected to be clever, to manage estates and arrange alliances, to understand both books and people. From an early age, Eleanor proved herself a master of all these things, her sharp intelligence matched only by her determination never to be merely an ornament to another's ambition. At 15, Eleanor's world changed overnight with the death of her father. Suddenly, she became one of the most desirable heiresses in Christendom, and soon found herself queen, first of France, then of England, her life mapped by treaties, armies, and the will of men who coveted her lands. Yet, unlike so many royal women, Eleanor refused to be used as a pawn. She engaged in politics with ferocious skill, negotiating directly with monarchs and barons, championing the rights of her children, and shaping the destinies of two nations. But it was not only her political genius that made Eleanor extraordinary. She became a beacon for the ideals of courtly love, turning her court at Poitiers into a place where poets, troubadours, and thinkers could debate the meaning of devotion, loyalty, and desire. Here, women were not just spectators, but judges and participants in the rituals of romance, a revolutionary idea that would ripple through European culture for centuries. Under Eleanor's guidance, the rules of love became almost as important as the rules of war. Her personal life was equally dramatic. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France, marked by conflict and frustration, ended in annulment, a rare act of defiance that shook the foundations of the French court. Not long after, she married Henry Plantagenet, who would become Henry II of England. Their union produced legendary offspring, among them Richard the Lionheart and King John, but was itself a storm of passion, politics, and rebellion. When Eleanor found her voice stifled and her influence challenged, she did not submit. Instead, she raised her sons in open revolt against their father, enduring years of imprisonment for daring to challenge the king's will. Through triumph and adversity, Eleanor remained a symbol of possibility. She maneuvered through the perils of royal life with remarkable resilience, refusing to accept the limited roles prescribed for women. Even as she aged, her influence grew, acting as advisor and regent, guiding the next generation with the same strength and wisdom that had shaped her own destiny. She became the living proof that a woman could not only survive in a world built for men, but could shape it in her own image. Eleanor's story, passed down in chronicles and ballads, offered hope to those who came after. She embodied a vision of love that was fierce, clever, and unafraid, a reminder that even in a world defined by constraint, there was always room for defiance and for dreams. For every woman trapped by custom or expectation, Eleanor was a torch in the darkness, showing that independence was not just possible, but worth every risk. And so, as the centuries turned, the legend of Eleanor of Aquitaine endured, not just as a queen or a mother, but as a force of nature who taught the world that rules, no matter how ancient, could always be rewritten. Her life became a testament to the strength and complexity of the human spirit, forever changing what it meant to be a woman in the Middle Ages and what it could mean to love and to lead. Scandal was a word Eleanor of Aquitaine wore like a crown, gleaming with the promise of change and the danger of defiance. In an age when queens were expected to be silent, patient, and content with the shadows cast by their husbands, Eleanor stepped boldly into the light, challenging every expectation of her sex, her station, and her time. Her story was never a simple arc from obedience to obedience. Instead, it became a wild, dazzling series of upheavals that forever altered the meaning of power, family, and feminine will. Her first great act of rebellion came at the end of her marriage to Louis VII of France. Their union had been uneasy from the start, a political necessity rather than a partnership of souls. Where Louis was pious and reserved, Eleanor was passionate, clever, and restless, yearning for a court where joy, art, and wit flourished. The distance between them only grew with time, and with each failed attempt to produce a male heir, whispers of disappointment and blame thickened around the throne. In a world where royal marriages were unbreakable, Eleanor did the unthinkable. She demanded an annulment. With papal blessing, she left the French court behind, her reputation bruised, but her independence intact. Eleanor's next move stunned Europe. Mere weeks after her annulment, she married Henry Plantagenet, soon to be King Henry II of England, a man nearly 12 years her junior, whose energy and ambition matched her own. Together, they forged a dynasty that would shape the fate of England and France for generations. Yet their marriage, too, was no storybook romance. While Henry conquered lands and collected mistresses, Eleanor wielded her own power, governing vast territories, overseeing courts, and ensuring her voice was heard in matters of state. When her patience ran out, when Henry's betrayals grew too brazen and her own sons were denied their rightful influence, Eleanor proved she was not content to merely survive scandal. She would create it. She became the architect of one of the greatest family rebellions of the Middle Ages, encouraging her sons, most famously Richard the Lionheart and John, to rise against their father. In a saga that swept across castles and battlefields, Eleanor risked everything for her children's futures and for her own sense of justice. The uprising was ultimately quashed, and Eleanor was imprisoned for more than 15 years, held captive by the very man she had once chosen. Yet, imprisonment did not silence her. If anything, it amplified her legend. Even from behind locked doors, Eleanor's influence persisted. She orchestrated alliances, managed her estates, and guided her son's political strategies through a network of loyal allies. When Henry died and Richard ascended the throne, one of his first acts was to free his mother, restoring her to the center of power she had never truly left. Eleanor's later years were no less remarkable. She arranged marriages for her grandchildren across the courts of Europe, ensuring the continuation of her bloodline and the spread of her influence. She navigated the dangerous politics of succession, negotiated treaties, and played peacemaker when her sons clashed. Each move was calculated, a testament to the keen mind and indomitable will that had defined her life. Throughout it all, Eleanor's actions sent ripples across Europe. Her divorces, her alliances, her open defiance of kings, these were not just personal gambits, but public reimaginings of what a woman could do. She refused to disappear quietly, even as gossips and chroniclers tried to paint her as dangerous, wild, or unnatural. Instead, Eleanor forced her world to reckon with her presence: queen, mother, schemer, and survivor. Through scandal and upheaval, she turned every misfortune into an opportunity to rewrite the rules. By refusing to be defined by her husband's choices or her society's judgment, Eleanor of Aquitaine carved a path that no queen had walked before. She left behind a dynasty of kings, but more importantly, a legacy of strength and self-determination that would inspire women and shake thrones for centuries to come. Eleanor of Aquitaine's influence radiated far beyond politics and royal intrigue. It touched the very way people dreamed about love. In the echoing halls of her courts, first in Aquitaine, then in Poitiers, something remarkable began to take root: the concept of courtly love, a revolution of feeling that would enchant Europe for generations and redefine romance itself. Before Eleanor's time, marriage was largely practical, a matter of alliances, heirs, and family fortunes. Affection, if it came at all, was a luxury that followed duty, not a force that could shape destiny. Yet at Eleanor's court, a new vision of love was quietly taking shape, one born not in secret, but in sunlight, performed in music, poetry, and conversation. Here, poets and troubadours found welcome and inspiration. They wrote of longing, adoration, and suffering, spinning tales where love became an ennobling quest rather than a social convenience. These troubadours, many of them from Eleanor's own lands, sang of impossible passions, knights who pledged their devotion to unattainable ladies, lovers who braved all manner of dangers for a single token or a glance. Their lyrics shimmered with both joy and pain, painting love as an exalted trial, a spiritual adventure, as well as a bodily yearning. For the first time, the experience of loving someone you could not possess, someone above your station, bound by vows, or simply untouchable, was not cause for shame, but for admiration. Love's suffering became a badge of honor, a test of courage and depth. At Eleanor's gatherings, these ideals were not just sung, they were debated, refined, and, in a way, enacted. Ladies of the court became judges of poetic contests, deciding which suitor's words most truly captured the agony and ecstasy of adoration. Knights and courtiers vied not just for physical triumphs, but for the intangible prize of a lady's favor, often pledging loyalty that would remain unconsummated. The rituals of courtly love were elaborate, filled with coded gestures, secret tokens, and layers of ritualized longing. A single touch of a hand or a glance across the hall could carry as much meaning as a public vow. What made this movement so revolutionary was its refusal to accept the boundaries set by law and custom. Courtly love was by definition impossible. It celebrated passion that could never lead to marriage, elevating the suffering of unfulfilled desire into a kind of art. It created a space where emotion, wit, and imagination reigned supreme, and where women, for perhaps the first time, became arbiters of taste and conduct. The lady was placed on a pedestal, not just as an object of beauty, but as a source of inspiration and challenge, her wishes and words guiding the drama of the court.
Inevitably, the culture of courtly love was both a game and a rebellion. It provided an escape from the hard necessities of life, a realm where fantasy and feeling could briefly transcend the world's expectations. Yet beneath the play, there was a subtle act of defiance, a claim that love could matter more than contracts, that longing could transform the soul, and that suffering for love was not a weakness but a virtue. The poets who thrived in Eleanor's circle, Bernard de Ventadorn, Chrétien de Troyes, and countless others, spread these ideas like wildfire. Their songs and stories traveled from court to court, shaping the dreams of nobles and commoners alike. Soon, the ideals of courtly love would inspire not just songs, but whole literary traditions, from the romances of Arthurian knights to the later sonnets of Petrarch and Shakespeare. Through Eleanor's vision and the voices she gathered, Europe learned to see love as something daring, noble, and transformative. The impossible romance was no longer simply a source of misery or scandal. It became the highest aspiration, a journey that tested the strength and imagination of all who undertook it. The revolution of feeling that began in her courts would outlast the walls that contained it, echoing in stories and songs for centuries to come. The culture of courtly love, born in the radiant courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine, flourished precisely because it was built on impossibility. It was not merely the celebration of affection or desire.
It was the art of yearning for what could never truly be possessed. The rules that governed these romances were as strict and formal as the laws of the land, yet they ran counter to every practical purpose marriage was meant to serve. In this paradox, the aristocracy found a thrill more potent than any victory on the battlefield or prize at a tournament. At the heart of courtly love was the understanding that the beloved, almost always a noble lady, often married to another, was unattainable by design. Knights and poets directed their devotion to someone whose affection could only be hinted at in glances, veiled in riddles, or exchanged in the briefest of encounters. The very act of falling in love became an exercise in patience, subtlety, and the refinement of suffering. To love openly would be to destroy the delicate balance. It was the secrecy, the distance, and the ever-present risk of scandal that gave the relationship its electricity. This carefully orchestrated longing found its rules codified in the so-called courts of love, presided over by noble women who debated the subtleties of devotion, jealousy, and the ethics of desire. There were strictures about how a knight might win favor. He must serve, obey, and suffer for his lady, proving his worth through courage, poetry, and relentless loyalty. Flirtation became a ritualized dance, filled with coded tokens. A glove bestowed in public, a ribbon hidden in armor, a poem slipped beneath a door. Every gesture had meaning, every meeting was a secret drama played out beneath the gaze of the court.
It was the pain of separation and the knowledge of what could never be that gave courtly love its paradoxical sweetness. Suffering was transformed from a source of shame into a badge of nobility. To pine for years without hope of fulfillment was not a weakness, but the ultimate proof of the lover's sincerity and character. In a world ruled by bargains and inheritance, where marriages were transactions and feelings often irrelevant, the agony of impossible love became the only true measure of the soul. This obsession with the forbidden appealed most strongly to the aristocracy, whose lives were otherwise marked by strict protocol and limited freedom. For noble women, who were frequently married off for reasons of family alliance, courtly love provided a rare space for power and self-expression. Within the rules of the game, they could set the terms, test the loyalty of their admirers, and become the architects of their own stories, even as those stories remained, in essence, dreams. For men, especially young knights, the rituals of unattainable love became a proving ground for valor and sensitivity. It was not enough to win battles or accumulate wealth. True greatness meant learning to master one's own longing, to channel desire into poetry or acts of devotion. Courtly love became an idealized trial, a crucible in which chivalry and creativity were tested alongside bravery and skill. The irony, of course, was that the more unattainable the object of desire, the more fervent the devotion became. Tales of lovers separated by duty, vows, or fate filled the halls of castles and inspired generations of artists. These stories often ended in sorrow or self-denial, yet their power lay precisely in their incompleteness. The unfulfilled promise, the kiss that never happened, the love that never crossed into reality, became a kind of perfection, untouched by the disappointments of everyday life. By making desire both central and impossible, the aristocracy of the Middle Ages transformed suffering into an art form. They created a culture in which the laws of the heart could exist alongside the laws of society, each feeding the other, and both sustaining a vision of love that, for all its anguish, could never quite be tamed or extinguished. In the end, it was this devotion to the unattainable and the rules that preserved its purity
that made courtly love so endlessly compelling, long after the courts themselves had faded into legend. Beneath the gilded surface of medieval courts and the lyrical fictions of troubadours, real stories of forbidden love were unfolding, stories as intense and heart-wrenching as any legend, and often far more dangerous. While poets turned longing into art, true lovers risked their lives for a chance at happiness, sometimes shaking the very foundations of their societies. Their dramas and defiance left marks not just in ink, but in law and custom, inspiring generations, and in some cases, changing the course of history itself. The tale of Romeo and Juliet, immortalized by Shakespeare, was not born from pure imagination. It drew its lifeblood from the chronicles of medieval Italy, where family rivalries and secret passions routinely collided. One of the earliest sources, the tragic saga of Mariotto and Ganozza in Siena, tells of young lovers torn apart by feuding kin, desperate escapes, coded messages, and, inevitably, despair. Their story, recorded in the 14th century, echoed through Italian households, a cautionary reminder of the price that must be paid for challenging family and fate. Other versions, from Verona to Florence, played out similar patterns. Two hearts drawn together by fate, separated by enmity, with only love letters and daring schemes to keep hope alive. Closer to home, the legend of Tristan and Isolde blurred the line between myth and lived experience. Their love, blooming in the shadow of royal obligation and political intrigue, was a direct affront to the values of loyalty and obedience that defined their world. Theirs was not a sanitized or idealized courtly affair. It was raw, reckless, and ultimately tragic, inspiring both horror and admiration. Songs and poems preserved their agony, but the real impact of their story was felt in the way it unsettled accepted norms, forcing knights and kings alike to consider that love might sometimes outweigh duty. Some stories even crossed the boundaries of class and law, sparking debates that would linger for centuries. The chronicles of France and England record the case of lovers who, separated by rank and property, defied their families and vanished into the wilds, sparking not only pursuit but legal battles over inheritance and legitimacy. In several instances, the courts themselves were forced to confront what had previously been unthinkable, that love, though forbidden, could demand a new kind of justice. These cases led to changes in inheritance rights, the questioning of arranged marriages, and even the hesitant recognition of the individual's right to choose a partner. Not every story ended in tragedy. Some lovers, like the famed Joffrey Rudel and his faraway princess, found a strange kind of immortality in longing itself. Others used disguises, cunning friends, or the shelter of sympathetic clergy to evade disaster and build quiet, hidden lives together. Their ingenuity in the face of oppression laid the groundwork for new ways of thinking about privacy, freedom, and the power of the human heart. Over time, these stories, real and imagined, spread far beyond their original settings. They became lessons and warnings, myths and aspirations, shaping the very language of love. Lawmakers and priests could not ignore the mounting evidence that passionate devotion, once considered merely dangerous or foolish, was also a force for transformation. When young people fled forced marriages or wrote desperate letters to sympathetic patrons, they chipped away at centuries-old structures of power, making space for the slow birth of new attitudes. The legend of forbidden love, then, is more than the sum of its tragedies. Each heartbreak, each flight in the night, each secret vow whispered in the dark, forced society to reconsider what mattered most: obedience or happiness, duty or desire. The true stories behind the myths did not simply end in loss. They left ripples that reached courts, laws, and the imaginations of all who followed. By daring to love against the odds, medieval lovers did more than inspire poetry. they set in motion a quiet revolution, one that still stirs in the stories we tell and the choices we make. The consequences of forbidden love did not fade quietly into history. They ignited waves of change, sometimes subtle and sometimes seismic, in the fabric of medieval society. The sheer persistence of real-life dramas, echoing those sung by troubadours and whispered by the desperate, forced people in power to confront the deep unrest beneath the surface of tradition. Bit by bit, the weight of individual stories, of heartbreak and rebellion, of clever escape and tragic consequence, pushed society toward a reckoning with the limits of control and with the power of human longing. One of the most curious and telling signs of this shift was the rise of courts of love in 12th and 13th century France. These gatherings, presided over by noble women and attended by poets and knights, were less about the administration of law and more about the arbitration of desire. Here, cases of romantic dispute were presented. Was a lady right to reject a persistent admirer? Could a knight's suffering justify his plea for favor? While half serious, half playful, these courts represented an astonishing break with tradition. For the first time, the feelings and choices of individuals, especially women, were elevated to matters worthy of debate and even judgment. The ripple effects extended beyond the poetic. In some cities, the accumulation of real tragedies forced authorities to reconsider the laws that bound marriage and inheritance. Young people fleeing forced matches sometimes found allies among the clergy, who, moved by compassion or wearied by endless conflict, began to argue that consent, the willingness of both bride and groom, should matter as much as family strategy or social expectation. In England and France, the slow but steady appearance of marriage by mutual assent in legal records marks the beginning of a new age, one in which personal choice started, ever so cautiously, to be respected. Other reforms crept in by necessity. When too many noble daughters vanished with secret lovers, or sons renounced their inheritance for a chance at happiness, families and rulers alike recognized that iron rules could not guarantee stability. Legal texts gradually shifted to address the practicalities of clandestine unions, the rights of children born outside the strictest codes, and the occasional validation of love matches, provided they did not upend too much social order. These changes were not always open or even officially acknowledged, but they signaled an undeniable loosening of ancient chains. Most profound, however, was the way stories, whether lived or sung, reshaped the imagination of an entire age. The courtly and tragic romances became lessons not only in the danger of passion, but in the necessity of compassion. The notion that suffering for love was noble, that longing was both beautiful and worthy of respect, undermined the old belief that happiness should be sacrificed for stability. The language of the heart entered law and custom by the back door, carried in the poems and pleas of generations. The emergence of these new attitudes was not uniform or uncontested. For every lover's victory, there were still countless tales of punishment and despair. But the world was changing. The demand for personal happiness, once considered dangerous, now had its defenders in the halls of power and in the whispered judgments of society's most influential women. Step by step, the ideals forged in the shadows, the secret vows, the passionate letters, the fierce claims of selfhood, began to influence not only culture, but the very laws that governed life and love. In this gradual but irreversible transformation, the old certainties gave way to something more humane, the belief that love could be not just a danger to society, but a gift to it. The lessons of heartbreak and hope, passed from legend to life, made possible a future where, at least sometimes, the choice of the heart could carry the force of law. And while the world would never become a utopia of free affection, the defiant dreams of forbidden lovers had opened a door that could never fully be closed. Across the patchwork map of medieval Europe, the rules of class and status seemed absolute. Nobility was set apart from the rest of humanity by birth, by law, and by ceremony. A shimmering boundary meant never to be crossed. Yet time and again, love proved itself the most stubborn of trespassers, quietly undermining the great walls of hierarchy with a single glance, a secret letter, or a moment of shared laughter. In the shadow of castles and cathedrals, real people took impossible risks for the promise of connection, challenging the rigid order of their world one stolen meeting at a time. The stories that survived, passed down in whispered rumor, recorded in court rolls, or captured in the scandalized notes of chroniclers, reveal how daring and resourceful lovers could be. In France, the tale of Jehan, a peasant who fell for Lady Isabel, the daughter of his lord, has endured for centuries. Their world was divided by custom and expectation. He toiled in the fields, she was tutored in manners and Latin. Yet a chance encounter, perhaps as simple as shared shelter during a storm, sparked a friendship that grew into a fierce, secret devotion. For months, they met in hidden corners of the estate, speaking in code and relying on loyal servants. When discovery finally came, the consequences were swift. Jehan was sent away, Isabel was confined to a convent, and their names erased from official memory. But the legend lived on, repeated by villagers as a parable of both the risk and the glory of loving across boundaries. Such stories played out in towns and cities as well, where the bustle of commerce brought new opportunities and dangers. There are records from Genoa and Venice of wealthy merchants who lost their hearts to favored courtesans, women whose wit and beauty made them celebrities, but whose birth barred them from respectable marriage. These relationships often began as business, but sometimes grew into powerful partnerships. Some lovers flouted every expectation, living openly together and facing ostracism or exile. Others negotiated clever arrangements, ensuring financial support, shared children, or even secret ceremonies that recognized a union the world refused to bless. In rare cases, the influence of a beloved could even shift the fortunes of a whole household or city, as merchant princes risked everything for women the world called unworthy. Even the monasteries, those supposed strongholds of spiritual purity, were not immune. The story of Brother Matteo, a young monk in Tuscany, and Lucia, a servant girl from the nearby village, survives in a handful of faded letters. Their bond, formed over simple kindnesses, a loaf of bread, a whispered prayer, defied every rule, both sacred and secular. When their secret came to light, Matteo was transferred to a distant abbey, and Lucia lost her position. But for years they found ways to exchange messages, sometimes passing notes inside loaves of bread or under the stones of a shrine. Their story, small and almost anonymous, inspired other villagers to believe that love could flourish in even the most barren soil. These crossings of social boundaries were rarely easy or safe. The risks were profound: loss of livelihood, banishment, violence, or worse. Yet for every pair who was punished or parted, there were others who found ways to endure, to hide, or even to escape to new lands where their histories were unknown. In border towns and on the fringes of society, people reinvented themselves, noblewomen becoming merchants' wives, runaway monks starting new lives as lay people, servants and craftsmen forging families in defiance of custom. What drew people to risk so much for love? Perhaps it was the simple conviction that the heart could see something the world could not. In a society obsessed with lineage, rank, and reputation, love across classes was not just a personal victory, it was an act of rebellion, proof that human connection could matter more than privilege or prejudice. Each secret meeting, each forbidden vow, chipped away at the notion that status was destiny. Over time, these stories, some tragic, some triumphant, quietly reshaped expectations. They gave rise to new myths, inspired songs and tales, and in some cases, paved the way for slow shifts in custom and law. The world remained stubbornly unequal, but its boundaries grew more porous, thanks to the courage of those who dared to cross them for love. In every age, it is these quiet revolutionaries who remind us that the heart's logic is its own, and that even the most formidable barriers can be breached, if only for a moment, by two people willing to risk everything for each other.
When love was forbidden, ingenuity became a matter of survival. Across medieval Europe, couples separated by law, custom, or status turned necessity into art, building elaborate systems of secrecy, disguise, and coded communication to keep their bonds alive. Each clandestine romance was a quiet act of resistance, and every success depended not just on passion, but on the ability to weave a tapestry of deception intricate enough to outwit even the keenest eyes. Some couples lived entire double lives, blending the everyday with the extraordinary. A noblewoman might host formal dinners for her family and guests, while slipping away in the dead of night to rendezvous with a lover hidden in the servants' quarters or the stables. Young men with forbidden sweethearts found allies among household staff. Maids and stewards who turned a blind eye, carried secret messages, or arranged meetings under the guise of errands. In convents and monasteries, the most trusted friends became accomplices, warning lovers of approaching danger or creating distractions to allow stolen moments together. Loyalty and shared risk turned ordinary acquaintances into a hidden network of support. For many, deception was not a single dramatic gesture, but a daily practice. Lovers exchanged codes that only they understood. A certain arrangement of flowers in a window, a pattern scratched in the dirt, a candle left burning at a particular hour. Letters were hidden inside hollowed-out books or sewn into the linings of garments, delivered through intricate relays to avoid suspicion. Some even used religious rituals as cover, meeting during confession, sharing prayers that doubled as declarations, or disguising affectionate glances behind pious bows. Sometimes, survival depended on even bolder inventions. Disguises and false identities were employed when separation became unbearable. A young woman might cut her hair and don a tunic, passing as a boy to join her beloved on the road, or slip into places women were never allowed. Men fled into distant towns, adopting new names and trades, erasing their past to start life with a lover the world refused to accept. Entire families would sometimes relocate under the guise of a pilgrimage, hoping a change of scenery would free them from prying neighbors and persistent relatives.
And not all help came from the shadows. Some lovers were protected by influential patrons, nobles or clergy who sympathized with their plight and used their authority to shield the couple from punishment. Others found refuge in communities where old rules had loosened, such as merchant ports or border villages shaped by diversity and necessity. In these liminal spaces, the strict boundaries of class and reputation blurred just enough for a hidden partnership to pass unnoticed. Still, the risks never truly vanished. The cost of discovery was high: dismissal, exile, imprisonment, or worse. So lovers perfected the art of misdirection, making themselves invisible among the routines of daily life. A stolen glance at market became part of a transaction, a touch of hands disguised as an exchange of coins or bread. Everyday tools became props in their secret play: a ring with a hidden compartment, a locket containing a coded letter, a musical phrase played at dusk to signal safety. At times, communities themselves became complicit. Villagers and townsfolk who admired the courage or sincerity of a couple might invent plausible explanations to cover for absences, vouch for stories that everyone knew were half-truths, or keep silent about sightings that could ruin reputations. Solidarity born from shared hardship and hope turned neighbors into silent allies, forming a protective web around those who dared to love outside the lines. The creativity that thrived in the shadows was both a shield and a celebration. Each successful subterfuge was a testament not only to the strength of feeling, but to the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and cooperation. For every couple who survived by their wits, there were dozens whose stories never saw the light of day, yet their ingenuity, bravery, and devotion shaped the world in quiet, lasting ways. In the end, these secret unions proved that love, once kindled, was far more than a fleeting passion. It became a force for transformation, capable of bending rules, forging alliances, and inspiring new ways of living, all in the name of connection. Against all odds, those who loved in secret showed that even the strictest world could be outmaneuvered, one clever plan, one midnight promise at a time. Of all the forbidden romances in medieval Europe, those between people of the same sex were among the most perilous, and required the greatest ingenuity to survive. While the Church thundered against such unions, and the law reserved its harshest punishments for their discovery, the desire for companionship and love could not be erased by threat alone. Across centuries and kingdoms, same-sex couples carved out secret lives, inventing hidden languages, rituals, and networks of solidarity to protect what the world refused to recognize.
Men who loved men and women who loved women lived in constant tension between longing and danger. The risk of exposure was not just social ruin or exile, but sometimes brutal punishment and complete erasure. Still, even in these harsh conditions, the yearning for connection found its way into the world. Lovers devised subtle codes to signal their feelings, a touch that lingered a fraction too long, a word with double meaning, a verse in a letter that only the intended recipient could decipher. Shared objects became tokens of devotion, a ribbon exchanged in secret, a carved charm worn beneath clothing, a flower pressed between the pages of a prayer book. In the cloistered worlds of monasteries and convents, where men and women lived apart from the rest of society, bonds sometimes deepened into something more than friendship. The intense emotional ties formed through shared prayer, labor, and hardship provided fertile ground for affection that dared not speak its name. Here, secret rituals took shape, oaths whispered by moonlight, tokens buried at the roots of ancient trees, candles lit in memory of a love that could only be acknowledged in silence. Some communities developed brotherhood or sisterhood ceremonies, a private liturgy of support, blessing, or even symbolic marriage, creating a protective framework in which intimacy could flourish, if only in the shadows. Outside the cloister, networks of solidarity emerged, sometimes stretching across cities or even countries. In larger towns, rumors spread of private gatherings, masked balls, midnight feasts, or friendship societies, where like-minded souls could find refuge for a few precious hours. In these spaces, guarded by trusted allies, people forged new identities and relationships, sharing stories and codes that might be passed on in careful whispers. The courage of these gatherings lay not only in their defiance, but in their creativity. Each gesture, each word, was a tiny act of resistance against a world determined to keep love invisible. Even language itself became a shield and a weapon. Medieval poetry is filled with verses that appear innocuous to outsiders, but which carried profound meaning for those in the know. The language of saints, heroes, and mythic friendships was repurposed to express feelings that could never be confessed outright. The bond between David and Jonathan in Scripture,
or tales of ancient comrades in arms became a discreet vocabulary for longing and loyalty. For women, stories of sworn sisters or Boston marriages centuries before the phrase existed offered a rare model for lifelong companionship unbound by traditional marriage.
Magic and mystery, too, found their place. In some circles, lovers sought protection or blessing through clandestine rituals, herbs hidden in clothing, talismans inscribed with secret prayers, incantations whispered in twilight. Such acts blended faith, folklore, and hope, creating a sense of agency in a world where power so often belonged to others. Yet for all the secrecy and danger, the stories that survive are not just tales of fear, they are evidence of resilience. Same-sex couples in the Middle Ages proved that the heart's longing could invent its own sanctuaries, no matter how small or fleeting. Through coded words, secret rites, and circles of trust, they built spaces where affection could endure, even if only for a moment. Their ingenuity and bravery, hidden in the margins of history, remind us that love, even at its most forbidden, will always find a way to be seen. Medieval Europe was a world obsessed with boundaries, of class, faith, gender, and desire. Yet even as strict lines were drawn, some souls quietly stepped across, reshaping their destinies in the process. The histories of those who lived between and outside, women passing as men, men who embraced gentleness and care, individuals who refused easy categories, reveal how love and identity could become both shield and sword in a hostile world. Among the most striking stories are those of women who donned male identities to carve out freedom, safety, or the chance for connection. Some entered monasteries disguised as monks, taking on new names and personas to live, love, and worship beyond the reach of a society that confined women to narrow roles. Church records and saints' lives tell of transvestite nuns, women who not only survived discovery, but were sometimes celebrated as holy figures when their stories emerged. Their reasons varied. For some, it was to escape an unwanted marriage. For others, a profound longing to join a beloved or to pursue a spiritual life denied to women. One such story is that of Hildegund of Neuss, who, after her father's death, cut her hair, adopted a man's clothing, and entered a monastery as Joseph. Living for years among fellow monks, she was eventually discovered only after her passing, when astonished brothers realized her true identity. Instead of condemnation, she was mourned and honored for her devotion, a sign that the community had come to value the person behind the mask, not just the mask itself.
Elsewhere, medieval Europe witnessed the reverence of male saints celebrated for qualities deemed feminine in their day: compassion, gentleness, and tender care for the sick and poor. Legends grew around men who devoted their lives to serving others, their sensitivity and selflessness seen not as weakness but as evidence of divine grace. These stories, immortalized in stained glass and song, subtly widened the range of acceptable identity, granting space, however small, for men to embrace roles beyond the warrior or patriarch. Behind many of these gender crossings lay stories of love, romantic, spiritual, or simply the deep bond of chosen family. For some, the adoption of another identity was a way to remain close to a partner or companion, hidden in plain sight. Disguised as brothers, some lovers traveled together, built new lives, or entered the same religious order, creating an existence apart from the marriage market and the dangers of exposure.
In rare but powerful cases, local communities protected these unions, weaving legends of miraculous birth, divine intervention, or blessed friendship to shield those who dared to live outside the expected script. These acts of self-invention required not only courage but profound creativity. Some women forged letters of introduction, learned to ride and fight, or memorized prayers in Latin to pass as men. Others learned the subtle art of blending in, listening more than speaking, keeping their secrets close. Men who found themselves at odds with expectations might lean into roles as healers, teachers, or artists, professions where tenderness and empathy were valued and where their difference could be recast as a gift. Society's reaction was never uniform. While some met with harsh punishment, others found acceptance, especially if their disguise was revealed only after years of service or devotion. Hagiographers, the writers of saints' lives, sometimes transformed transgression into holiness, blurring the line between sinner and saint, man and woman, in the pursuit of a larger spiritual message. In the spaces where law and custom failed to see the whole truth, love and loyalty carved out new possibilities. Whether motivated by romance, friendship, or sheer survival, these acts of crossing and concealment quietly challenged the world to widen its sense of what was possible. Their legacy lingers, not in grand monuments, but in the fragments of story and memory left behind, a quiet testament to the power of identity, resilience, and love's refusal to fit within any single frame.
In the tumultuous centuries of medieval Europe and the Crusader states, few romances were more dangerous or more profound than those that blossomed across the vast divides of faith and conflict. When Christian and Muslim armies clashed for control of Jerusalem and the Holy Land, when suspicion and propaganda painted the other as both enemy and stranger, the simple act of loving across such lines became an audacious challenge to everything society demanded. And yet, against the backdrop of war, siege, and suspicion, the heart's longing sometimes found a way to reach across even the most fortified boundaries. Stories of these forbidden romances ripple through chronicles, legends, and travelers' tales, hinting at lives lived in the margins, where identity was always a negotiation and every gesture of trust came at immense risk. In the borderlands of Spain, where Christian kingdoms pressed against the remnants of Al-Andalus, it was not unheard of for a young knight to be captivated by the beauty or wit of a Muslim noblewoman, or for a merchant's daughter to fall in love with a scholar from the other side of the city walls. In the Levant, amidst the shifting allegiances of Crusader lords and sultans, moments of peace or trade allowed fleeting encounters, at market stalls, at oases, during festivals, where eyes met and words were traded in a blend of languages. These romances were more than personal. They were acts of quiet rebellion. In a world that insisted on loyalty to faith above all, the crossing of religious lines was viewed with fear and outrage. Conversion was fraught, often forced, and rarely trusted. Yet, sometimes, love inspired a reimagining of self, a willingness to learn a new tongue, to observe unfamiliar customs, to brave the uncertain space between worlds. Some lovers risked everything to be together, running away to distant lands, forging new identities as refugees, or seeking the protection of sympathetic rulers. Many such stories end in heartbreak, as families or communities intervened with force. Chronicles tell of daughters spirited away in the night, of lovers separated by the iron logic of war, and of children raised in secret, belonging to both worlds and to neither. But not every tale concluded in sorrow. There are legends of couples who, through ingenuity and alliance, managed to survive together on the borders, merchants who built their fortunes as go-betweens, knights and noblewomen who negotiated fragile truces, scholars who used their learning as a bridge for dialogue and respect. Some unions even changed the course of history.
Marriages arranged for political reasons, once intended to cement peace treaties, sometimes blossomed into real partnerships, with queens or princesses acting as cultural mediators between rival courts. In Sicily, in the courts of Frederick II, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian courtiers lived and loved side by side, their cooperation and friendships shaping the most progressive society of its time. Behind each of these stories is the same thread: love's stubborn refusal to be limited by border or creed. In risking everything for another, these lovers tested the meaning of faith, loyalty, and forgiveness, not as abstract ideals, but as daily choices. Their courage did not erase the divisions of their age, but it did offer a different vision, a world where trust, curiosity, and compassion might sometimes outlast hatred. Centuries later, these tales still resonate, not just as echoes of the past, but as reminders that human connection can pierce even the thickest walls of war and suspicion. Where crusades and edicts sought only conquest, love insisted on seeing the person within the stranger. For a brief, shining moment in the heart of conflict, it was the courage to care, not the command to conquer, that truly changed the world. Looking back over centuries of forbidden longing, secret alliances, daring escapes, and relentless devotion, it becomes clear that the story of love's defiance is, in many ways, the story of civilization itself. Each act of courage, a glance exchanged across class lines, a vow whispered beneath monastery arches, a letter sent in code, a flight across enemy borders, sent ripples outward, quietly shifting what society thought possible. The impossible romances of the Middle Ages did not vanish when lovers were parted, punished, or erased from official records. Instead, they took root in the cultural soil, pushing up new shoots of imagination, law, and hope that still shape our world. The greatest gift of these stories is the way they transformed the human imagination. Out of the pain and beauty of forbidden love, medieval poets, troubadours, and chroniclers forged new languages for longing and hope. The sonnets of Petrarch, the tragic ballads of Tristan and Isolde, the playful rituals of courtly love, all carried the DNA of those who suffered and risked for the right to choose their heart's companion. These tales leapt across borders and generations, inspiring writers from Shakespeare to Austen, from Dante to the storytellers of our own day. Through them, yearning became an art, and heartbreak a testament to the strength and stubbornness of human feeling. Yet, the legacy runs deeper than literature. The endless negotiation between duty and desire eventually altered the very rules of society. Step by step, laws that once enforced obedience to family and faith began to make space for individual will. The concept of marriage as mutual assent, the slow recognition of women's agency, and the hard-won rights of those who crossed lines of class or faith all were hastened by the examples, warnings, and quiet victories of forbidden lovers. Even the idea of privacy, of the sacredness of personal choice, emerged in the shadow of battles fought not with swords, but with letters, glances, and steadfast refusal. Morality, too, was reshaped by the echo of these old rebellions. Where once shame was the tool of control, over time, compassion crept in. Stories of suffering for love taught generations to question whether rules existed to serve people or the other way around. The stubbornness of the heart, its refusal to accept boundaries drawn by others, became a value in itself, celebrated as passion, authenticity, or even heroism. Love, once the greatest threat to stability, became the force most prized for its ability to inspire change, to unite what was divided, to envision a world remade by empathy and imagination. And so, what began as impossibility became, over time, the measure of true feeling. Today, when we speak of real passion, we echo the language of those who risked everything for a hope that society denied. In every novel, every film, every whispered confession that dares to choose connection over convenience, we find the legacy of medieval hearts that would not be stilled. Forbidden love did not merely survive the age of stone walls and iron laws, it transformed them, teaching us that the greatest power of all lies not in force, but in the courage to care. In this way, the impossible loves of the past have become the foundation for modern dreams. What was once outlawed is now cherished. What was once silenced now celebrated. The pain and risk endured by those who came before was not in vain. It carved channels through which the waters of freedom, choice, and genuine feeling could finally flow. Even now, in a world that still draws boundaries and invents new taboos, the lesson remains. There is no wall that the heart, armed with hope and ingenuity, cannot learn to climb.